to the next talk in track 3. So Eric will be talking about know-out, and then we will discover what this means. So without further ado, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you. It's the unofficial Entra track for the next hour or so. So yeah, getting developers to follow standards is easy, and other lies we tell ourselves. And we'll just sort of jump right into things here. As mentioned, I'm Eric Woodruff. Currently work at Sempris as our chief identity architect. I previously worked on our security research team. We put out Purple Night, right, which is not a pitch for that, but a lot of security research in Entra, particularly background here. Social media handles, you want to reach out to me about this stuff or anything else, feel free to hit me up on any of those. And we'll just jump right into things here. So with the backstory now, before we actually get into the meat of NoAuth, I actually want to give a hat tip to the title here, trying to carry on this other lies we tell ourselves talk. So, right, 2023, Steve Seifus had deprecating NTLM is easy, and other lies we tell ourselves. And then last year I got to watch The Good Doctor in a story with deprecating Azure AD Graph API is easy, and other lies we tell ourselves, right? And at the core of this, it's developers, vendors of software applications not implementing things properly when we think it's easy, right? So it felt like the title sort of fit here. All right, and now just moving on to NoAuth. So this was disclosed originally by Dscope on June 20th, 2023, right? And it was around April 2023 that they opened their case with MSRC, according to them, and between then and June, worked on some resolutions with Microsoft, right? And essentially this is a vulnerability in apps using OpenID Connect with Entra ID, right? So if you have multi-tenant applications that have the sign in with Microsoft button, right, they're likely using OpenID Connect under the hood to, authenticate you, authorize you against Entra. And as Microsoft very strongly points out, right, that this is rooted in anti-patterns with how developers are implementing OpenID Connect, right? So they kind of say developers are doing things wrong, and I'm not going to disagree with them, but it still leaves, customers vulnerable. Right, and ultimately this vulnerability here with NoAuth is that it allows for account takeover, impersonation, right, however you want to put it, of any user in the vulnerable SaaS application, simply if you know the user's email address, right? So it's not that hard to deduce people's email addresses these days. I think when I started at Sempris, I was getting emails to go buy Apple ID or Apple gift cards, right, for my CEO like a week after I started. So, very easy to figure out email addresses. And Dscope basically labeled this like a cross-identity provider type attack. But so if we kind of look at the timeline here, right, and we have us, June 20th, 2023, NoAuth is disclosed, and then here we are today at Troopers, right? And then you may say, well, who cares, right? I mean, this is now a plus 2-year-old vulnerability, right? And when you'd read the news at the time, it kind of seemed like Microsoft fixed things up. Right, and so we were actually digging into the research that Dscope did to see if there's anything that we could sort of build off of with the work that they had previously done. And at the time of disclosure, MSRC published this blog article about NoAuth and this risk of privilege elevation in applications, right? And I thought it was interesting in particular that they have this customer impact statement here, and it's the only time I'll read an entire sort of bit of slide to you folks, but we have here that Microsoft identified several multi-tenant applications with users. They use an email address with an unverified domain owner. Although unverified email addresses do not pose a risk to applications that do not utilize email claims for authorization purposes, right, the application owners have been notified and were provided with guidance on how to modify their applications, right? So far Microsoft is basically saying, right, email as a claim, as an attribute, right, that an application receiving isn't inherently, dangerous, but developers could potentially be doing something, effectively wrong with how they're using that claim, right? But Microsoft has notified all the ones that were using this claim and told them that if they're doing something wrong, here's how you can resolve it, right? And they go on to say, if you do not receive notification, your application is not consuming these claims for unverified domain names. Again, you could read into this saying, if you didn't receive a notice from us, right, and I have no idea how they contacted these people, then your application isn't vulnerable, right? So you could probably say, well, I didn't get an email, and we're good here, right? And to protect customers and applications that may be vulnerable to privilege escalation, Microsoft has deployed some mitigations to omit token claims from unverified domain owners for most applications. And we'll kind of dive into that bit further. But the thing I kind of had beef with, even when this was first released by Dscope and the messaging from Microsoft, is that, if you look at some various articles that were published about this, right, we have things like, Azure AD enabled, right, it's past tense as if it's fixed, or, right, bleeping computer here says Microsoft fixes Azure AD off flaw enabling account takeover. Again, Petri here, right? Microsoft patches critical no off flaw in Azure AD apps. So you could just go read the news, right? And sort of say, oh, well, it was like a Microsoft thing and Microsoft fixed it, right? And like, we're all good. There's nothing else we need to do. And funny enough, I actually completely forgot that 2 years ago, not that one would necessarily read my ranty blog, I actually was complaining about how the reporting on this was not very accurate and saying that it was just like fixed and everyone can wipe their hands of this. So right, if we go to our timeline here again, we can essentially say that, right, June 2023, that NoAuth was declared fixed. And I think there's another thing that happened very soon after that, within a month, right, is the Storm 0558 incident, which definitely overshadowed a lot of other, stuff going on from a security perspective in the Microsoft ecosystem, right? So the NoAuth stuff drops, and less than a month later, Storm 0558, which, if we remember, right, that's the big signing key leak thing that happened, and it was very time-consuming on the Microsoft side to, right, try to come up with how did this happen, and, apologizing to customers and all this sort of stuff. But you may still be saying, right, like, well, who cares, right? This is still a couple years old. Why are we talking about this now? So, as I was, mentioning, right, we were researching OAuth, and, fortunately or unfortunately, right, NoAuth is in fact not dead. It's still out there, and we found applications that were still vulnerable to this when we were exploring things. So also a bit interesting or different than the focus that Dscope had. So Dscope, they were focused on, and now I'm using a screenshot from Adobe here. As far as I know, this was never vulnerable. It's just, a nice screen grab for showing, right, different identity providers, right? So Dscope's focus was really on this cross-IDP attack where, right, a legitimate user authenticates with Google, right? So they go to Adobe and they use their Google, account for Google Workspace or something to sign in. An attacker would configure an Entra tenant with, a user that has an unverified email address on it, and essentially go to the same application and authenticate with Entra. And the application effectively had account merge logic flaws within it that did not verify email ownership. Right, and ultimately, the attacker is in the SaaS application as the legitimate user, right, with access to, whatever they'd have access to there. So again, right, if we kind of abstract this out a bit, we have our SaaS application here and our Google account, right, and I'm authenticating that SaaS application kind of high level here, right, and then an Entra account comes in. And many times in these scenarios, when you have this account merge logic, right, generally speaking, if the developers have, implemented multi-IDP auth well, you get an email, right? And the email will say, hey, we see you signing in from Microsoft. Before we're going to let you do it, hit this magic link, right, to verify that it is you, right? Or the application might have some other sort of MFA in, right, where maybe you'll get hit with a one-time PIN, passcode type thing that will be sent to your email, right, and saying, hey, go to this thing and enter this in, right? Because we're just trying to interrupt this flow to make sure that, right, you actually own, right, both this Entra account that's claiming to be you and, this Google Workspace account that's claiming to be you. Right, but at the core of it, if the application didn't have that logic in place, right, this is where the Dscope focus was that, I could just go into Entra, say I'm whoever I want, right, go to the vulnerable application, and it's just going to say, hey, let's merge these two accounts and, you're in. So, building on the DScope research and what we were looking at was really Entra to Entra sort of cross-tenant type stuff here. So, in our scenarios here, we have our legitimate user authenticating with Entra, right? An attacker still then configures another Entra tenant, and, they add a unverified email attribute to, some user that's going to impersonate the legitimate user. Right, and in this instance, though, the application is not following OpenID Connect standards for how authentication authorization should be implemented here, right? And where, effectively this is a cross-tenant type attack, right? And I think this is important because, again, if you were a developer and you go back and, when NoAuth dropped and you're looking at your application, you're like, well, we only use Entra, right? Or maybe we have local accounts in Entra, but we're not cross-IDP, we don't support Facebook or Google or something, right? So we don't need to worry, right? Meanwhile, the developers are actually not implementing OpenID Connect properly, again, in their applications. And so we'll kind of drill into that a bit deeper here, right, with this cross-tenant attack problem. So we'll kind of look at an example of a well-formed application here, right? So if we're following the standard, we have our Contoso SaaS application here, right? And again, we could sign in with a local username or password, right? Or we have that sign in with Microsoft button, sign in with Office 365, it can be labeled different things, but essentially it's, right, a multi-tenant application. Right, and so Contoso, right, the software vendor, they're going to have an app registration that exists that's used for, authenticating against Entra ID. And then all the consumers of this application, right, they're going to have a service principal in their tenant when they first consume this application, right, that represents it in their tenant here. And so after we have that app, sort of onboarded into our tenant, right, Eric at fabricam.com here, right, I'm going to go authenticate. I go out to the site, I hit sign in with Microsoft, right? And an ID token is going to be generated and, sent to the SaaS application. Sometimes applications will use OAuth 2 and, access tokens as sort of a pseudo authorization thing. But, right, either way here, essentially, right, we're getting an ID token out to the application. Right, and an application is going to have some user table, some user database on the back end, right? And in that database, we're going to have, different things, attribute data about me, but most importantly is making sure that we are capturing the subject and the issuer, right, because these are unique immutable identifiers, right? So the issuer is effectively the tenant ID from Entra, right? And so that's going to be unique because the tenant ID cannot be duplicated anywhere. And the subject, even more importantly, identifies that this is Eric, right? And subject is a pairwise identifier, and the docs don't exactly describe how it's formulated, but generally it's like a hash of, the application ID, the user's object ID, and I think maybe the tenant ID, right? That basically is saying, hey, this is Eric, and the application will always know, this is in fact Eric, right? And then this way, if an attacker was to try to pull this off, they'd get some sort of error from the application when they're trying, well, they wouldn't get an error. The application would obviously think there's someone else, right? Because they're seeing a different subject here. So for a NoAuth vulnerable app, right, again, I'm still going out to the application, I'm signing in, right? The application's getting that ID token from Entra, right? We still have that user table on the back end. But the problem here, right, is that the application is just keying off the mail attribute, right? So this is not unique, and it's not immutable, right? It's very easy in Entra to go set the mail attribute to basically anything that you want, right? So again, to abuse this, it's actually a very simple sort of attack once you understand the basics here. You just go have your evil tenant here. So we're going to onboard the application into our evil tenant. And then I've got, my evil user, Eric at evil.cloud, but I send my email address to Eric at fabricam.com, right? I go authenticate, right? I pass that ID token off to the app, and it's like, oh, look, your email address is Eric at fabricam.com. Like, hey, you're in, and you're getting access to, all the same stuff that this legitimate user would have access to. Right, so again, just a demo here, just to sort of show how simple it is to set an unverified email address. Right, so we're just looking up a user here in graph, and we can actually see that, right, we're highlighting that this is Adele V's email here, which is a big long string, and apologize, I should have increased the screen size before recording this. And then we just run a patch operation right on the user account and graph, where we're simply going to set the mail to, right, in this instance, my Semperis email address. And then again, we just get the user and we can see that immediately it's updated in Entra ID. And again, if we went and looked in the portal, right, we'd see it's set to whatever we want to set it to. So it's like super easy to do. Right, and also you can convert guest invite to member and hybrid synced users also, right? So in Active Directory, we can set someone's mail address to some other attribute and Entra Connect will flow that up with an unverified domain as well, right? So, I mean, I think in reality, an attacker would probably not use these methods, right? They're not probably going to breach someone's, Active Directory to then go use claims in it to get into some other application somewhere else, right? But just the Dscope research really focused on just one way of right, setting that unverified email address claim, and there's a lot of different ways to go about this. Right, and so in our testing of this, again, when we wanted to just verify this sort of stuff, right, we can easily use jot.ms to go look at these claims, right? So when we go back to this diagram, and right, we're getting that ID token here. So it's relatively easy to configure an app registration with an Entra that just redirects to jot.ms. Now you wouldn't want to ever do this in real life, but like with something that's in production, but you can basically have it redirect the ID token right to jot.ms so that you can easily decode this, right? A lot of times these production applications, depending on the OAuth flow, and we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, right, isn't going to be client side where the application is receiving the ID token, right? So if you really want to explore this stuff, using something like jot.ms and redirecting just to sort of play with is the easiest way here. And again, right, so we're signing into an application here as Alex Wilbur at fabricam.cloud, right? And once we authenticate, and we're going to this jot.ms test application that we set up in our Entra tenant, right? And so we can see here that, right, we have our email address here that is, Alex Wilbur at fabricam.cloud, right? And then, though, again, this is a multi-tenant application, so now the, right, quote, attacker, right, is going to go out to the same app, right? And we can see here that the attacker is signing in as themselves, so it's, Adele V at blah, 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 on Microsoft.com. And once they authenticate, right, we can still see here that they're getting that same email address, right? Again, whatever was set within Entra. So, super easy to sort of play with and learn how this functions, right, without actually having a SaaS application available to sort of attack. Right, so when we're looking at abusing these flows, right, when Dscope published their work, Microsoft implemented some mitigating controls here. Right, so we know that there is this concept of verified and unverified domains, right? So within, Entra, within Microsoft 365, right, when you're onboarding, a tenant for mail, or you just want to have a custom domain, right, that domain has to be verified, right? Either usually through text or MX record verification, something like that, right? So we have that concept of, verified and unverified domains on our tenants, right? So an application can actually call additional claims from Entra to ask it if the email address is verified or unverified. Right, and by default, app registrations created after June 2023 have this remove unverified email claim essentially set to true, which by default will block the app registration, or the application, I should say, from receiving the mail claim at all on the ID token, right? So this is something you won't actually see. If you read the docs, they make it sound like that these are all modified, but it's just sort of on the back end, right? And we'll look at this later, that you just won't get the mail claim at all. But, these things can still be bypassed, right? Because a developer can still go in and set remove unverified email claim to false, right? And now they're going to get that email claim within the ID token, right? And also applications created for June 2023, as we go look at that MSRC blurb, right? If they were using email claim, the fix was simply Microsoft emailing them, right, and telling them, please don't do this anymore. But, right, who knows if the app developer actually, listened there. So, when we're researching and trying to find applications that were vulnerable to this, we also had some coinciding research going on around the Entra gallery, right? So the Entra gallery, if you're, familiar with it or maybe not, right? If you go into the Entra portal and we go into enterprise applications and we can choose new application and we get this gallery here, and we can actually filter by applications that support OpenID Connect, right? So we can enumerate the gallery and essentially look for, all the applications that support OIDC. Right, and so in our poking around then, so this was in the fall of 2024, at the time we found 1,017 applications registered in the gallery using OpenID Connect. Now I should clarify that if you're using a multi-tenant and developing a multi-tenant application, like it's not going to be in the gallery unless the developer, a vendor, goes and basically asks Microsoft to have it put out there, right? So there's many, many more applications that are using OpenID Connect, and only Microsoft would really know these numbers, right? That are not going to be within the Entra gallery here. So we have our 1,017 applications, and we ended up testing 104 of these to see if they were vulnerable to no-auth, right? So we spent about roughly an entire day of going through these 104 applications, authenticating them as a legitimate user, right? Sort of testing out the app and then going into our, quote, attacker tenant, and seeing if we could pull off the sort of no-auth attack on it, right? And so the reason that we only tested 104 is that, right, we were interested really in applications that had a sort of easy, sign up, sign in type of flow with, free trials, things like that, right? Or some applications you can just sort of go sign in with Microsoft and it will right, sort of just in time create an account in it. Right, basically we're not going to go ask vendors for demos or trials and stuff like that, right? We just wanted to see how applicable this vulnerability still was, right? And so out of these 104, we actually found that 9 were vulnerable, right? And so if you look at this diagram, it might seem like, well, that's a very sort of small number out there, right? Like, it's not that bad. But, right, if you look at out of 104 tested, right, this is about, we found 9, so it's about 8.6% that were vulnerable, right? So, if you apply sort of statistics to this where you can sort of bend numbers in any way that you want, right, in theory you could extrapolate this out, right? I mean, there's tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of SaaS applications out there, right? And again, only Microsoft really knows the ultimate number that is using Entra ID, right? But you could go out and, sort of claim that there could be, 1 million vulnerable applications. Now, right, I'm being satirical here, but the reality is that, right, there's probably a lot more that are, in fact, vulnerable, but we just don't know about it, right? It's kind of like proving a negative here. So, with our timeline, right, so December 3rd, we opened a case with MSRC, basically saying, hey, we found applications that were vulnerable to no-auth, and we have some other ideas that we think could help protect customers further, essentially, and here they are, right? As well as just a lot of details on the apps that were, specific in the Entra gallery. Right, and so of these 9 applications, right, this isn't like name and shame, so I'm not going to actually talk about what the applications were, right? But the thing that was concerning to us, or, who the vendors, I should say, were, but there was an HR platform in here, right, that we found vulnerable. Again, in our testing, right, you'd obviously have a lot of PII that is out in an HR system. Again, it would not be unreasonable to think that I could go deduce who an HR administrator is at a company, right, and figure out what their email is and basically be in as the HR admin. Interestingly, there's 2 applications that, despite us and Microsoft still contacting them, are still vulnerable. So there's another system out there that, we're sort of redacting what it is, because currently it's still in the gallery. It would take you a while to still poke around, but that also has PII in it. We found 3 different knowledge sharing collaboration platforms, right, which were things that were like, well, they could potentially have, architecture and other type of diagram things that an organization might use for like IT and security in them. The other redacted platform, right, this is where they claim to have 40,000 plus customers, on their website, right, and they're still vulnerable, right, and we told them about this back in December. There was a business coaching platform that had Office 365 integrations, which we also thought was interesting, right? Because now this allows you to essentially pivot right into Office 365. So this had like calendar and mail type integrations in it. Some construction site management platform, and there was also a meeting scheduling platform with Office 365 integrations in here again, right? So not only was it troubling from a data exfiltration perspective that I could just go into these apps and get whatever I want, but now I could also, right, potentially get into someone's mailbox, right, by being able to maybe read or write mails them or, send calendar invites and do other, functions as that user. Right, and for a little pizzazz, now I do have a heavily redacted video here that of the HR platform that was vulnerable, but they have fixed this. Right, but just kind of wanting to show this attack in action. When I've been speaking with some other people about this, right, the thing I keep getting asked is like, well, is it actually used in the wild, right? Are people actually vulnerable? And it's like, well, I don't know, but we found applications out here, right? So, on our left, a legitimate user here, right, is signing into this platform. Signing in very slowly. Right, and now we're in the HR application here, and we can essentially go, right, sort of see we have our 2 employees, within this application, right? I mean, it's a very simple test, but it's just, right, proving, I think the problem here, right? So now on the right, we have our attacker, right, who's going to go out and they're going to hit, sign in with Microsoft 365. Right, and again, they're going to pop in their own UPN, they're going to authenticate to their own tenant here. I had to work on my editing skills for videos to cut out some of the dead space. Right, but once they're in, right, because this application was just, right, matching on email address, we can see that we're in as, the same user here, right? So, and I can actually go in to one of these user objects and, right, sort of edit it with things, and obviously editing data, right, would sort of probably send a flag to the customer, but just was trying to show, right, that yes, we are in fact in as the same user here. So we're, editing the name, right, and then over on the legitimate side of things, right, we refresh it and we see in this app it's already updated there. So. Right, so this was also a bit interesting, maybe sort of sad, is the application vendor response to all this. So, as I mentioned, we're looking at our timeline here, and December 2nd, so a day before we opened the case with MSRC, we started contacting vendors saying, hey, we found your application was vulnerable. And at first we were being a bit more vague, right, because we're not really sure who to talk to. So we're saying, we found a vulnerability in your application. We'd like to talk to you about it. Now, I get that vendors probably get hammered with a bunch of, crap from people being like, oh, your thing is vulnerable, and it's, maybe not. But this was the overall feeling that we got back, right, from most of these application vendors, unfortunately, in trying to work with them, right? So the vendor responses, the quickest was an application that was resolved within a week, right? So we worked with them, basically, helping them understand what the problem was. They updated some things. We did some testing for them to sort of verify that they fixed it. Right, and the longest resolution is still ongoing. Even with MSRC also bothering, these 2 vulnerable platforms, they haven't done anything about it. Right, but as I mentioned, it was sort of problematic in trying to figure out who to contact, right? So some of the things we would initially go to the website, try to find, some privacy policies, some security blurb, right? And it would have all this stuff about, how they're SOC 2 this and, You know, they really care about your privacy and your data and et cetera, and it's all great, right? But there's not necessarily like an email address, right? We just want to know who to contact. So, you know, we'd go open a ticket, right? If there was some sort of ticketing platform, we trolled LinkedIn a little bit to try to determine, hey, maybe who's like, you know, their CISA or data protection officer, stuff like that. Right, trying to find different ways to figure out who to contact without just sort of randomly sending people like, you know, this specific vulnerability. You know, and as I mentioned, that vendor response really varied. You know, some of them, like we opened a support case and we're like, you're vulnerable to this thing, and support was basically like, oh, well, you should contact security, and we contact the security address, and it just seems to go to like a dead end, right, with no response. One of the vendors had a vulnerability reporting database. Again, so we reported this through this system that they had back in December, and it was like, well, it was February, March, we retested everything again and found that they were still vulnerable. So there was no way to reach out to them, so we eventually found some email address, and they just simply told us to say, hey, go fill out, you know, a thing in this you know, vulnerability reporting database. And we're like, well, we already did, right? And here's like the report ID, you can go look it up. And they still, I mean, it took a couple months after that before they actually resolved things. Now, I get like people have priorities, right? But I think that once you sort of explain this to them, and you know, when we're being a bit more blunt and saying like, I can just authenticate as any of your customers, right, in theory, and get into the application, do whatever I want, you know, nobody really seemed to care still. And also, interestingly, as we were testing this, we found some vendors actually seemed to remove their Entra integration, right? Like, it's like they couldn't figure out what to do. So now it's just gone. You can only like sign in with Google or like a local account anymore. And some of them, and there are some theories around potentially why that might be, aside from laziness. But also I noticed a few applications that previously you could go test, they've actually paid-walled them now. And I actually ended up signing up for a trial for one of them, and then canceled it and found it was still vulnerable. But it also made me wonder, right, like, did they really fix the problem? Or are they actually just putting some sort of blocker in place, right, so that their application can't be tested to this vulnerability, right? I mean, it's all sort of subjective thoughts here, but I thought it was still interesting that that seemed to be the focus. You know, assuming there's a correlation between us reporting this, MSRC bothering them, right, and then they make some authentication change in their application. So, you know, as there's a lot of, you know, people here that are interested in identity security and the Microsoft ecosystem and whatnot, I also thought it'd just be interesting to talk about the case with MSRC, because this, again, is essentially what it was like, right, trying to get a response from Microsoft. So, you know, we opened that case December 3rd. Again, here we're here today. Right, so a day later, MSRC acknowledges the case with like an auto response thing where, you know, the case has been opened, you know, and we'll let you know what we find once we find things. Right, in the meantime, you know, December 17th, we let Microsoft know that one of the application vendors that we're working with resolved things, right, because we're presuming they might be contacting the vendors as well, just letting them know, hey, like this one, you don't have to worry about. And so then sometime in December, I was awarded 60 points. So I'm like, okay, like, you know, I'm not in it for, you know, the money and points sort of thing, but I was like, oh, well, it must mean they're taking this seriously because you only get points if something's being taken seriously. And then it was just waiting, right? So from that point on, I haven't heard anything. So on March 17th, I reach out to MSRC with a, you know, hey, just like wondering what's going on here because you've been quiet for a while. Now I know they're off, you know, partying with their 0-day quest stuff and whatnot, but you know, there's cases, and yes, I'm being a little snarky here. And I also notified them the day after that, you know, I did have intentions of submitting this to conferences like Troopers, but I, again, was asking for help, right? Because I'm like, this is already a disclosed vulnerability. So, right, I'm not looking to upset you folks. What should I do? Because I want to go talk about this. I think people should be aware of the problem. Right, I have a case open on it also. Can you give me some guidance? And the only guidance I got is the day after the 60 points in the portal were removed, right? So I'm like, all right, well, someone must be looking at the case, right? And so then I ask MSRC, I'm like, hey, like, just wondering what's going on because I noticed these points are gone and I still don't have a severity assigned, right? I've received no communication aside from the auto acknowledgement from MSRC. I don't know the severity, I don't know anything about the case, right? And then in April, the case is just closed with the thank you, we'll acknowledge you on the MSRC portal, have a nice day thing. So obviously this is telling what they, think of it relative to, my case that I opened. And so then actually, I was annoyed. At the end of the month, I opened I sent a message to MSRC Listens, which is their complaint channel that they have if you disagree with how a case was handled. That has been acknowledged, but I haven't really heard anything else back about this. But so also right in the MSRC portal, I did notify Microsoft once the talk was accepted for Troopers that I was going to be speaking about it, I'm going to blog about it, all these sorts of things. And it kind of felt like as we're getting closer to the talk, that all of a sudden maybe some people there are starting to feel differently about things because over the past few weeks I've been in sort of some back channel communications with some folks at MSRC. Now I still haven't received anything from like my case manager, but I was told some stuff and I was told some of the stuff that I was told I could talk about, right? So in particular, one of the things was Microsoft again just saying from the identity perspective, like, right, it is up to developers to make sure that they're using the email claim properly. Right, and so this kind of gets into defense and mitigation of this, right? But this is, a summary of what I feel like the Microsoft, stance on this is, right? We suggested things that we think they could do to, further at least warn customers of this, but so far nothing has happened, right? And if we actually talk about mitigation from like an application customer perspective, right? So say, right, I'm consuming a vulnerable application, right? Again, we're bypassing conditional access, right? Any authentication, any MFA requirements, right? Any, cloud app, CASB type things that people are deploying, because all the auth is still happening in the attacker's tenant, right? So the attack is really completely out of band. Like, it's not a great analogy, but in a way I kind of wanted to say it's almost like a, right, silver ticket type attack in Active Directory where I can just go to the resource and claim that I'm this user and the app's just like let me in. And we all seem to be worried about those type of attacks in AD, but out, in the cloud, like, well, nobody seems to really care, right? But the customer really can't do anything about it aside from basically, if they know the application's vulnerable, warning the vendor to change it, or abandoning the application, right, which is pretty extreme. And from a detection perspective, right, it's probably next to impossible to actually detect that this is happening, right? Because we're not going to have any Enter ID sign-in logs, right? Because all of this is happening in the attacker's tenant, right? And there's no indication of the unverified email claim on the service principal, right? So in part of the investigation, I was like, well, can we look at the service principal and try to understand, right, if we can at least see if maybe the app developer is, in fact, right, asking for this claim or using it, right? There's nothing on the service principal from like an attribute perspective. So really, right, you're left with, basically trying to have to correlate authentication logs from your SaaS application, right? So, and in reality, I'd like to find a customer that's actually sending all their SaaS application, auth logs to, Sentinel or whatnot. But even beyond that, most SaaS applications, right, are notoriously not good at even logging authentication activity, or, it's something you have to download as a zip file and all these things, right? So it doesn't really offer any sort of robust type of detection, right? And then you're left with, well, you could test the application, right? But it's time consuming. And, in theory, a customer could go, trying to find the, no. I mean, I'm good using the mic if you, no.
Doesn't? Well,
No.
then-
Oh, all right. This is fine. So, but you could test the applications, but it's very time consuming to do this, right? You know, and again, I wasn't sure which meme to sort of pick that I made here to be snarky at Microsoft, right? But again, this is what I feel like things are effectively for, you know, customers right now. Right, I wish that we could flag service principals, and that's something we suggested in our case, but Microsoft's response is like, blame developers and write a blog and, you know, have a nice day. So as a developer though, right, you can mitigate this by fixing your application, right? And there is a lot of stuff out there that Microsoft has written that will help developers understand how to move away from using mail claim, you know, email attribute, for keying off users. Now, there's some challenges within it that can be a rabbit hole in itself, right? But it is up to the developer to fix their app, right? And they can check the application for remove unverified email claim. If they're not using email, right, they can go and you know, set this to true, right? But likely, if they're vulnerable, they're not going to know about that. But there's also, right, reasons developers might want an email address, right? They might want to send you an email for some reason. But they still need to fix their application, and going back to using subject and issuer, or at least using object ID, right? If they have multiple applications and issuers, something that is going to be more immutable for a user identifier. And also test your application, right? So one of the things is we worked with a few vendors who did resolve this, but we found that when they first implemented what they thought were fixes, and they asked us to say, you know, can you go test this? And we found that we were still able to sort of perform the no auth, you know, attack on their application, right? So they eventually fixed it, but I would really say that those vendors need to actually go through the steps and, you know, test things to make sure that they're not vulnerable, right? And again, fix and test your applications there, so. Right, and so for removing that unverified email claim, there's the authentication behaviors, and I'll have a link to a blog, because I apologize again that this might be small, but it will be in the blog. Right, so we can actually go look at that remove unverified email claim, right, by going to authentication behaviors on the app registration, right? So this is something the developer would do, right? And we're gonna see here that if this is set to true, but like I was saying earlier, when Microsoft put that change in where this was set to true by default, what you're going to find on app registrations is you just get no data back, right? So it's on the back end where if it's not specifically set to false, right, it's just by nature inherently true. But once you modify it, right, then you need to go set it to true on the app registration. But also, you know, developers, if say it's a lightweight integration, they're not integrating with, you know, Graph API for, you know, Office 365 stuff, right? They can still pivot to using the user info endpoint, right? So this is a thing within OpenID Connect that you can basically go ask Enter ID for information about the user object that's in question here, right? And we're going to get the same subject back so we can match that to our user in question. And then also we're going to have that unverified email claim in here, right? And now this is where it's safe because this is post-authentication, right? I've already authenticated with an ID token, so, you know, from an auth perspective, we're safe. We can still go call the user info endpoint, right, and get the person's email address. And we don't care if it's unverified, right? Things are okay at this point. And so, you know, as I mentioned, so blog post here, like I say, every time I use one of these URLs, especially because Nestori works for Microsoft, intro.ms is for sale to Microsoft if you want, but you can go to sl/intro.ms/noauth, and there's going to be a blog out there that has details and a bit more than what I've talked about today. Right, and again, just as far as the key takeaways here, right, I think that right, noauth is extremely dangerous depending on the application, right? The customer is sort of stuck in the middle between Microsoft and the app developer. The app developer, right, is unaware that they're implementing authentication improperly. Microsoft's pointing the finger at them, and the app developer probably doesn't even know that the finger is being pointed at them, right? But the customer is the loser here because they're the one who's going to have their data exfiltrated. They're the one where an attacker could potentially pivot and move right into other things like Office 365 through that application. This is where it's extremely tough because, like I said, it's trying to prove a negative, right? I've been asked, well, how popular is this? And I think it is an extremely stealthy way if you find a vulnerable application to reside inside it, and essentially do whatever you want in there, and likely no one's going to know, right? The app dev isn't going to be looking for anything to say, hey, we're vulnerable to no-auth, because they would just go fix their stuff, right? And it's going to continue to exist, right? So back to the reporting that's like, it was fixed, right? As long as developers keep on developing and making up their own rules for how authentication should function, right? We're never going to be able to fully get rid of no-auth, right? Now, I do think that as new apps are deployed, because developers would have to go through that extra step, right, and say, hey, we want to receive the unverified email claim. Right, it is a barrier, it's a mitigation, it's some friction for developers where hopefully they'll actually follow standards. But ultimately, right, again, because there's legitimate reasons to have an email claim, Microsoft has basically come back and said, like, we're not going to ever take this out, right? You just have to do a little extra work to make it available. And like I said, right, customers really have no protection around this. From every sort of thing I thought of SSPMs and other stuff, right? There's things built into browsers these days. But I think ultimately, right, because this is an out-of-band type attack, that it's just going to continue to persist with very little protection for customers. And with that, I think we have, it's only 45 minutes, so we have time for questions.
So, thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Hello, great talk. You talked about now about Enter-ID tenants that are used to compromise other tenants or other SaaS applications. Do you verify also if Microsoft accounts or Google accounts are abused a lot for this scenario? And if yes, what can companies do to protect their domains from Google accounts or Microsoft accounts that are used with their own domain?
Well, I can probably talk about business might. So I didn't check Google. Right now, I will say, right, Microsoft and Google sort of have engineered themselves into these scenarios where they're really the only two, right, sort of workforce, IDPs out there that have these sort of centralized ways of, authenticating or authorization. I'm not a Google expert. I don't know how they implement OpenID Connect, and actually I think there's some non-standard way that they implement that, like sign-in with, the sign-in with. No. Okay. There's some of the way that they implement that whole like sign-in with Google thing that I don't know if it's necessarily OIDC. So it's a good question, but I guess I'll say that, right, with Microsoft maybe engineering themselves into a corner here, right, it's this combination of having like this single endpoint for authentication authorization, right, for any sort of Microsoft account, whether it's workforce or consumer, but you mix in guests, right? And I don't know what the Google world looks like with guests, because it's ultimately, right, those guest objects that are always going to have an unverified email address, right, because they don't exist in your tenant, like, on purpose, because they're a guest, right? But there's all sorts of things where guests, right, need to be contacted, right, by Entra, whether it's, right, sending guest invites or potentially OTP, depending on the type of auth, right? So, yeah, back to the original question, because I got it in a bit of a tangent. I haven't tested Google. I don't know, though, if Google has support for something like guests. And I would presume that if you have a personal Microsoft account, right, that you could potentially speculate that this would work in an application that is vulnerable if, say, it's like signing in with a Microsoft consumer account. But I didn't test that. But the other way around, you wouldn't be able to use a Microsoft consumer account to act as someone else, right? Because if you go try to sign up for a consumer account, well, these days it's blocked, I think, because they don't want to deal with the headaches of, asking you, is it a work account or is it a consumer account? So maybe that answers some of your question there. So.
Any other questions? Where? I don't see it. Oh,
I can do it also. Thank you. Do you know the service in background which is used there? So it is B2C or is it the new one, external ID for customers?
So this is neither, right? This is just a multi-tenant SaaS application. So it's not using B2C or external ID, right? So when you deploy a multi-tenant SaaS app, effectively the customer's right tenant is the authentication or is the identity provider, I should say. So the applications we tested, they were just straight up multi-tenant apps that we're consuming. There was no B2C or external ID in play.
Thank you.
any other questions? Okay, then thanks again, Eric.
Thank you.
This concludes our talk. So we are going into our coffee break, and the next talk, the anti-forensics talk here in track 3, starts at 4:45. So enjoy your coffee.